Today, we dive into a gripping story of power versus dignity, arrogance versus patience. It begins with Lillian Davenport, a powerful businesswoman boarding a first-class flight with an air of entitlement. But instead of enjoying her journey, she turns it into an unexpected challenge for Julia, a dedicated black flight attendant. Tensions escalate as Lillian relentlessly harasses Julia, pushing her to maintain professionalism while enduring blatant disrespect. Lillian's actions not only disrupt the flight but also ignite a chain of events that shake her world and leave behind profound lessons for everyone involved. Can Julia overcome this trial with grace and dignity? And what will Lillian learn from her behavior when the truth is revealed to the world? Don't miss this emotional story, where true values are put to the test. If you believe in the power of patience and fairness, hit subscribe to join us on this journey. What would you do if you were in Julia's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The luxurious car rolled to a halt at the airport gate, its wheels gliding effortlessly over the polished brickwork. A poised woman emerged, instantly drawing the attention of onlookers. Her fitted black dress accentuated her commanding presence, while a designer handbag perched conspicuously in her hand. With a flick of her blonde hair, she scanned the crowd with an air of aloofness, her confident stride carrying her toward the first-class check-in counter. "Good morning, Mrs. Davenport. It's a pleasure to serve you today. Here are your boarding pass and first-class lounge access," the attendant greeted warmly. Mrs. Davenport gave a curt nod, accepting the pass without a word. Her cold gaze lingered momentarily on the staff member, as if evaluating their worthiness to serve her. Then, with a turn that left a trace of her expensive perfume, she walked away, leaving an unspoken tension behind. The first-class lounge was an enclave of luxury, its leather furnishings and soft lighting exuding exclusivity. Mrs. Davenport placed her handbag on the table and adjusted the champagne flute served moments ago. The serenity was short-lived. As she approached the boarding gate, her gaze fell on a young flight attendant with dark skin. The attendant stood tall, exuding a welcoming confidence that made Mrs. Davenport's brow furrow slightly. Do they truly allow someone like her to serve first class, she thought, her discomfort evident in her expression. Once on board, Mrs. Davenport's critical eye followed Julia, the attendant, scrutinizing every movement. Julia maintained her professional demeanor, greeting her with a polite, "Welcome, Mrs. Davenport. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to assist you." Mrs. Davenport barely acknowledged the greeting, her response cool and dismissive. After settling in, she remarked frostily, "I expect first-class service today. Don't let me down." Julia responded with a slight nod, sensing the weight of judgment in the customer's stare. She was familiar with such interactions, but they never failed to leave an invisible mark. Shortly after takeoff, Julia began serving beverages. As she placed a glass of juice on Mrs. Davenport's table, the latter abruptly interrupted. "I asked for orange juice chilled, no foam." "This is foam. Change it," she demanded, her voice sharp. Julia hesitated briefly before responding with measured professionalism, "Certainly, ma'am. I'll bring another right away." As Julia walked away, Mrs. Davenport muttered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I don't understand how they hire staff these days." The tension simmered, but Julia's practiced calm kept her focused. The flight progressed, each encounter between the two marked by an undercurrent of unspoken judgments and silent resilience. A middle-aged man seated nearby frowned slightly but remained silent. Julia returned with a new glass of juice, carefully placing it on Lillian's table. Instead of accepting it, Lillian picked up the glass, scrutinizing it meticulously as though searching for flaws. After a few moments, she smirked. "It'll do." Julia gave a slight nod, her expression unreadable. But then Lillian raised her voice, intentionally drawing attention from the surrounding passengers. "Next time, don't be lazy like that. First class is not for those who do a half-hearted job." The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. A young woman seated nearby sighed and whispered to her companion, "Unbelievable. She's so rude." Julia continued to serve other passengers, yet she could feel Lillian's eyes constantly on her, waiting for her to slip up. Every movement Julia made placing meal trays, adjusting a passenger's seat was scrutinized. Despite the constant pressure, Julia remained composed, pushing her frustration deep inside and reminding herself to stay calm. When it came time to serve coffee to a passenger nearby, Julia carefully carried the tray toward them. As she bent down to pour the coffee, Lillian shifted her body slightly, deliberately brushing against Julia's hand. The tray tipped, spilling the hot liquid onto Julia's sleeve. Lillian let out a dismissive laugh, her eyes filled with feigned innocence. "You need to be more careful. I told you, first class demands professional staff, not clumsy people like you." Julia froze for a moment, the burning sensation on her sleeve paling in comparison to the sting of humiliation. She looked at Lillian, her eyes briefly revealing the hurt before she regained her composure. "I sincerely apologize for the mishap, ma'am. I'll clean this up immediately." Lillian didn't respond, merely lifting her chin in a gesture of dismissal, signaling Julia to leave. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the cabin. A nearby passenger, visibly irritated, turned to Julia and quietly said, "You shouldn't have to put up with this." Julia thanked him with a faint smile, but inside, a steely resolve took root. This was just the beginning, but she knew she had to defend her dignity and self-respect. Julia encounters the first wave of harassment from Lillian Davenport on a first-class flight. Lillian's arrogance and condescending attitude quickly create a tense atmosphere in the cabin. Despite the rising hostility, Julia maintains her professionalism, setting the stage for a challenging ordeal. Can Julia's patience and resilience withstand the trials to come? Stay tuned as the conflict escalates and values are put to the test. Share your thoughts in the comments and follow along this compelling journey. The whispers grew louder among the passengers in first class following the coffee incident. Some glanced discreetly at Mrs. Lillian, while others turned their attention to Julia, the flight attendant who was trying her best to remain composed. Julia picked up the empty tray, carefully wiping the spilled coffee from her sleeve, though the stinging sensation lingered. Mrs. Lillian reclined in her seat, arms crossed, her cold gaze following Julia as she resumed her duties. Once again, Lillian offered a mocking smile, as if reveling in a small victory. "How strange," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the cabin. "I always thought first-class staff were supposed to be more professional. Is this what first-class service looks like?" Julia paused for a moment, her hand tightening around the tray. Instead of reacting, she took a deep breath, turned, and continued her work. Lillian's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as though embarrassing Julia was a source of amusement for her. Later, when Julia served the main course, Lillian continued her tirade. "Is this what I ordered?" she asked, tilting her head in feigned curiosity. "Look at this wilted vegetables and meat that doesn't seem evenly cooked. Who could eat such a thing?" "Ma'am, this is the dish exactly as described on the menu. If it's not to your liking, I can request the kitchen to prepare another," Julia responded, her tone calm and professional. "No, I don't think so." Lillian pushed the plate toward Julia, her gaze defiant. "Take this away. I won't eat poorly prepared food." Julia nodded without further comment, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of hurt. Once again, her patience was tested, and she could feel the weight of the passengers' stares. A young woman seated nearby shook her head and whispered to her companion, "I feel so bad for the flight attendant, but she's amazing for staying so calm." Julia returned to the service area, only for the call button at Lillian's seat to ring again. When Julia approached, Lillian didn't even look at her, instead tapping her nails impatiently on the table. "The orange juice you brought me earlier wasn't to my liking. Bring me a new glass, colder this time, and without any foam. Don't mess it up again, or I'll have to speak to your manager." Julia nodded, but this time her resolve began to waver. "I'll bring a fresh glass right away, Mom," she said, her tone steady yet with a faint edge that hinted at her dwindling endurance. Lillian leaned back, watching Julia disappear from sight. "How terrible. I don't understand why this airline hires people like her," she remarked to an older gentleman seated nearby, who had remained silent until now. This time, however, he spoke up. "Ma'am, I think she's doing an excellent job under the circumstances. Perhaps you could go a little easier on her." Lillian turned to him, her stare icy. "You're not the one paying for my service. I have the right to demand what I deserve." The man shook his head and sighed, but said nothing further. Julia returned with the orange juice, carefully lowering the glass onto the table. Just as she released it, Lillian nudged the armrest, causing a small spill on the table. "Do you truly not know how to do your job?" Lillian said loudly, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is absolutely unacceptable." Julia took a deep breath, suppressing her frustration. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. I will clean this up immediately. As Julia bent down to wipe the table, a voice rang out from a nearby seat. She's doing just fine. There's no need for this. A middle-aged woman, clearly unable to bear the injustice any longer, had spoken up. Lillian spun around, her eyes blazing with anger. This is none of your business. Julia straightened up, her eyes briefly meeting the supportive woman's with gratitude. But the tension in the cabin was palpable. Lillian turned back to Julia, her expression one of steely determination. I'll be reporting this. Neither you nor your manager deserve to work here. Julia didn't respond, but her hands gripped the tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. After finishing her cleanup, she walked directly to the chief attendant's station. I believe I need to report this passenger's behavior. She's deliberately causing issues and disrupting the flight, Julia said, her tone calm but resolute. The chief attendant nodded and gave Julia a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You've handled this situation very well. I'll take care of it from here. Lillian intensifies her harassment, creating discomfort not only for Julia but for other passengers as well. Captain Harris steps in to calm the escalating situation, but his intervention only adds to the rising tension. The confrontation between power and dignity has officially begun. Will Julia's professionalism hold firm through this storm? How will Captain Harris ensure justice prevails? Don't miss the next chapter, where difficult decisions are made and the truth begins to surface. Share your thoughts below. Chief Flight Attendant Caroline, with her calm and professional demeanor, approached Mrs. Lillian's seat. Her steady steps seemed to diffuse some of the tension in the cabin. Nearby passengers cast quick glances in her direction but quickly turned away, signaling their reluctance to get involved. Good afternoon, Mrs. Davenport, Caroline began, her voice measured and composed. I'm Caroline, the chief flight attendant for this flight. I've been informed about the challenges you've encountered, and we deeply regret if our service has not met your expectations. Mrs. Lillian, her arms crossed as she leaned back in her seat, cast an imperious look at Caroline. That's right. I think your team needs a lesson in how to provide proper service. I paid for first class, and what I've received so far has been far below the standard I expect. Caroline nodded slightly, maintaining her calm tone. I understand, ma'am. We always strive to provide the best experience for our passengers. That said, I hope we can work together to ensure the rest of the flight proceeds smoothly. Lillian remained silent for a few moments, her sharp eyes scanning Caroline as though assessing her. Finally, she spoke, her voice cutting. Fine. But make sure your team does their job properly. I don't want any further disappointments. Caroline exhaled softly and inclined her head. Thank you for your understanding, ma'am. If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. She then turned and walked toward Julia, offering her a quiet word of encouragement. You handled that very well. Keep your spirits up. Julia nodded, a faint smile flickering across her lips. But deep down, she felt that the situation was far from resolved, and this temporary calm was just a pause in the ongoing storm. Less than 20 minutes later, as Julia delivered the main course to Mrs. Lillian, tensions flared up once more. Julia carefully placed the plate on the table, double-checking to ensure everything was correct. However, the moment she withdrew her hands, Lillian's sharp gaze fixed on the dish. What is this? She demanded, her voice icy. This meat is overcooked and the sauce is watery. Do you call this first-class quality? Julia worked to maintain her composure. Ma'am, this dish has been prepared according to the menu. If it's not to your satisfaction, I can request the kitchen to remake it. No need, Lillian snapped, shoving the plate to the center of the table, causing some of the sauce to splatter onto Julia's sleeve. This is inedible. Take it away. The cabin fell silent immediately. Nearby passengers froze, their stunned gazes shifting between Lillian and Julia. A young woman covered her mouth, whispering to her companion, "She's truly out of line." Julia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, though this time her eyes no longer held the same patience as before. She bent down to retrieve the plate without uttering another word. Caroline quickly stepped in after witnessing the scene unfold. Mrs. Davenport, Caroline began, her voice calm but firm. We sincerely apologize. I hope you can find it in yourself to sympathize. Lillian interrupted sharply, cutting Caroline off. I don't think sympathy is what's needed here. Your staff clearly needs retraining. This isn't the first time she's messed up. Caroline, though maintaining her poise, responded in a more serious tone. Mrs. Davenport, we will do everything we can to ensure your satisfaction. However, I kindly ask that you refrain from disrupting the experience of other passengers. Lillian let out a mocking laugh. Disrupt? Are you more concerned about them than about me? I'm a first-class passenger. I have the right to demand proper service. Standing nearby, Julia felt anger rise within her. But before she could speak, Caroline subtly shook her head, signaling Julia to return to her duties. Reluctantly, Julia stepped away. A few minutes later, Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a stern and authoritative demeanor, entered the first-class cabin. His slow, deliberate steps and watchful gaze assessed the situation as he approached. Stopping before Lillian's seat, he gave a polite nod. "Mrs. Davenport," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "I'm Captain Harris, the pilot for this flight. I've been informed about some issues during the journey. I hope we can resolve this matter without disrupting the rest of the flight." Lillian looked up at him, her expression defiant. "Resolve? I believe the problem lies with your team, not with me. I only expect the service I paid for, but your staff has been careless and incompetent." Harris maintained his calm demeanor, his voice steady yet imbued with authority. "Ma'am, could you please specify what has left you dissatisfied?" "Start with your staff," Lillian said, pointing directly at Julia. "She spilled coffee, brought poorly prepared food, and has been completely unprofessional." Harris glanced briefly at Julia, who stood a short distance away, her expression strained but composed. Turning back to Lillian, his voice deepened but remained clear. "Mrs. Davenport, I will thoroughly investigate what has transpired. However, I must kindly ask that we all maintain mutual respect during this flight." Lillian smirked, her face showing no sign of remorse. "Respect? It seems your team is the one that needs a lesson in respect." The tension in the cabin remained palpable, with every pair of eyes now fixed on the captain. Harris, taking in the situation, gestured subtly for Caroline and Julia to step back. He prepared himself to handle what was shaping up to be one of the most challenging confrontations of his career. As a video of Lillian's behavior spreads rapidly on social media, her actions are exposed to the world. The overwhelming public outrage brings Julia a wave of support, but the situation spirals beyond Lillian's control. How will Lillian cope with the fallout? And will Julia finally find the justice she deserves? Stay tuned for the next chapter as the story takes a decisive turn. Don't forget to share your thoughts and follow the journey. Captain Harris maintained his calm but firm demeanor as he faced Mrs. Lillian. Meanwhile, her arrogance became increasingly apparent, as though she believed she had complete control over the situation. The nearby passengers remained silent, their eyes fixed on the tense exchange. "Ridiculous!" Lillian's voice rang out, loud enough to command the attention of everyone in the cabin. "I've never encountered such substandard service. A major airline allowing staff this unprofessional? Do you think first-class customers will tolerate this?" Harris regarded her with a piercing but composed gaze. "Mrs. Davenport, we value all feedback from our passengers. However, I must once again request that everyone maintains mutual respect." "Respect? I see nothing here worth respecting," Lillian sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you even know who I am? I could make this go viral and ruin your airline's reputation overnight." Julia stood silently in the background, biting her lip, the sting of Lillian's words cutting deep into her sense of dignity. Yet she remained quiet, though her clenched fists betrayed her inner turmoil. Caroline, standing beside her, gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Nearby, a passenger named Mr. Thomas leaned toward his companion and whispered, "She clearly thinks she can control everything, but I doubt the airline will let this slide." Lillian didn't stop. She stood, pointing a finger directly at Julia, her tone sharp and accusatory. "She's the reason this flight has turned into a disaster, spilling coffee, serving terrible food, and even daring to give me defiant looks. Completely unacceptable." Harris remained calm, but his tone grew firmer, each word delivered with precision. "Mrs. Davenport, I understand that you are upset. However, these accusations will need to be verified." Lillian smirked, her eyes flashing with challenge. "Verified? Fine. I'll make sure this entire ordeal goes online myself. You can't even begin to imagine the consequences. Just wait and see." Passengers began murmuring among themselves, many expressing their disapproval of Lillian's behavior. A young woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "I feel so bad for that flight attendant, but I don't think the captain will let her win." As the tension in the cabin reached a suffocating peak, a calm voice rose from a nearby row. "I think we can resolve this here and now." All eyes turned toward the speaker, an elegantly dressed middle-aged man named Daniel, seated just a few rows away from Lillian. Rising slowly, he held up his phone, immediately drawing attention. "I've been recording this entire incident from the beginning. If verification is needed, I believe this video will be very helpful." The cabin fell utterly silent. Lillian froze, her expression momentarily betraying her surprise before she quickly masked it with arrogance. "That video proves nothing. You can't possibly understand how I feel." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his voice gentle yet commanding. "Your feelings don't justify demeaning others. I believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect, including the staff serving us." Murmurs broke out among the passengers, many nodding in agreement with Daniel. Harris glanced at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I'll review the video immediately." Lillian, now realizing that the tide of attention had turned against her, clenched her teeth, her eyes blazing with anger. "I don't need to explain myself further. This is an insult to a first-class customer like me." Harris, maintaining his authoritative yet composed demeanor, signaled Caroline and Julia to step back. "We will handle this matter in the fairest way possible. However, I must remind you, Mrs. Davenport, that any actions violating in-flight regulations will be held accountable." Julia quickly walked back to the service area, her hands trembling but her eyes resolute. Chief Attendant Caroline approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Julia, you've done exceptionally well. Go change into a fresh uniform and take a moment to rest. I'll handle things from here." Julia nodded, feeling a small sense of relief as she stepped away from the tense atmosphere in the first-class cabin. However, the bitterness of humiliation still lingered in her heart. Back in first class, Captain Harris turned to face Mrs. Lillian again. His gaze was no longer tolerant but now exuded the authority and decisiveness of someone in charge of the flight. Holding the phone with the video recording in his hand, he straightened his posture and spoke with a tone both clear and steely. "Mrs. Davenport, I've reviewed the footage provided by a fellow passenger. It clearly shows how you've treated our flight attendant and your deliberate attempts to disrupt this flight." Lillian raised an eyebrow, her disdainful smirk still firmly in place. "So what? I'm the customer and the customer is always right." Harris's sharp gaze didn't waver. "You have every right to expect excellent service, but you do not have the right to insult my staff or jeopardize the safety and order of this flight. As of now, I am making a decision: you will not receive any further services for the remainder of this journey." Lillian was momentarily stunned but quickly regained her haughty demeanor. "Who do you think you are to speak to me like this? I can make your entire airline apologize." Harris remained unfazed, his voice lowering but becoming even firmer. "I am the captain of this flight, and I have ultimate authority to ensure its safety and order. Mrs. Davenport, I am instructing you to remain seated for the rest of this journey. Any further disruptive behavior from you will be dealt with in strict accordance with aviation regulations." The passengers in the first-class cabin had their full attention on the confrontation. A few nodded subtly, clearly in agreement with the captain's firm decision. A middle-aged woman whispered to her companion, "Finally, someone is stepping up to handle this." Lillian slumped into her seat, her eyes blazing with fury, but she realized there was nothing more she could do. A tense silence enveloped her, her arrogance subdued by Harris's authority. Though unspoken, it was clear to everyone that, for the first time during the flight, Lillian was no longer in control. Caroline returned to the cabin, quickly assessing the situation and giving Harris a brief nod of acknowledgement. Lowering his voice, Harris spoke to her. "Make sure all staff stay focused on their duties. We need to land this flight safely and avoid any further disruptions." Julia, now in a clean uniform, emerged from the service area, her expression more resolute than before. As she walked past Lillian's seat, the woman didn't look up. Julia said nothing, but internally, she felt a small measure of dignity restored. When the flight landed, Lillian remained in her seat as instructed by Harris, though her eyes continued to shoot angry glares at the crew. The surrounding passengers began gathering their belongings, but no one had forgotten the dramatic events of the flight. Harris waited until all the other passengers had disembarked before approaching Lillian. "Mrs. Davenport, you will be escorted to the airport security office to address your behavior during this flight." Lillian sprang to her feet, her lips pressed into a thin line. You have no right to treat me like this. I will escalate this to higher authorities. Harris remained unshaken by her threats, calmly signaling to the waiting security personnel at the door. Please escort her to the security office. Lillian was led away in silence, her expression a mix of defiance and rage. As she passed Julia, she cast a sharp, cutting glare, as if to silently declare that the matter was far from over. Julia met her gaze steadily, refusing to look away. In that moment, she felt the strength of solidarity from her colleagues and the captain, who had stood by her during one of the most challenging experiences of her career. The airport security room, a small, cold space, echoed with the measured footsteps of security personnel. Mrs. Lillian Davenport sat with her arms crossed, her eyes filled with defiance. Far from remorseful, she appeared as though she was waiting to assert her authority. A security officer approached her, asking a series of questions regarding her behavior on the flight. Lillian responded dismissively, her tone cold. I don't see why I'm being held here. I was the one mistreated. Your staff should be the ones questioned, not me. When Captain Harris entered the room, his eyes met Lillian's arrogant gaze. He turned to the security personnel, his voice calm but firm. I'm here to provide additional details about the incident. Before Harris could say more, one of the officers' phones rang. After a brief, hushed conversation, the officer turned to Lillian with a nod. Mrs. Davenport, you are free to leave. This matter doesn't require further investigation at this time. Harris frowned. She violated in-flight conduct regulations. This behavior could pose a risk in other circumstances. I strongly suggest that she be held accountable. Lillian shot up from her seat, a look of smug triumph on her face. I told you this would be resolved quickly. You have no authority to detain me. Harris remained composed, though it was evident he felt frustration at the situation's outcome. Lillian turned to him, her voice cutting. Captain Harris, I will make sure your staff, especially that flight attendant, never work again after this incident. And if you continue to oppose me, I'll ensure you lose your position with the airline as well. As Lillian left the security room, Harris stood still for a moment, restraining his disappointment. He knew the weight of Lillian's influence posed a significant challenge for his crew. Julia and Caroline, two colleagues he deeply respected, might face repercussions simply because of an arrogant passenger unwilling to acknowledge her own wrongdoing. In the hours that followed, news of the incident spread quickly within the airline. Julia was summoned to the office for discussions about the event. Caroline stayed by her side, offering constant reassurance and support. While Julia maintained a brave front, the lingering pressure from Lillian's threats weighed heavily on her mind. Later that afternoon, Lillian was invited to a meeting at the airline's internal offices. This time, the situation had escalated. Along with Captain Harris, a senior executive from the airline was present for the discussion. The bright, professional office space was charged with tension, setting the stage for a critical confrontation. As she entered, Lillian held her head high, clutching her designer handbag, her voice icy from the first words. I'm here because you requested it, but I hope you won't waste my time. The executive, Mr. Patterson, a composed and sharp-witted man, stood to shake her hand. Good afternoon, Mrs. Davenport. Thank you for coming. We'd like to clarify a few matters regarding the incident on today's flight. Lillian smirked, her expression one of indifference. I believe everything is already quite clear. I'm the customer, and I didn't receive the level of service that my payment deserves. Patterson maintained his calm but firm tone. Ma'am, we've received detailed feedback from the flight crew, as well as corroborating evidence from other passengers. What transpired doesn't align with the standards we expect from both our customers and our staff. Lillian interrupted, her tone laced with sarcasm. Evidence? You mean a video recorded by another passenger? Do you think that's sufficient to accuse me? I have powerful connections and I won't let anyone damage my reputation. Captain Harris, standing nearby, kept his serious demeanor. He spoke up, his voice steady and resolute. Mrs. Davenport, this isn't just a personal matter. Your actions on the flight didn't only affect our staff, they also disrupted the experience for other passengers. As the captain, I cannot ignore this behavior. Lillian let out a laugh, clearly unfazed. Very well. Let's see what you intend to do. But let me warn you, if Julia isn't fired, I'll make sure this airline regrets it. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Patterson took a deep breath, preparing for the next step. Meanwhile, Lillian's arrogant demeanor remained unchanged, oblivious to the fact that the situation was escalating far beyond her expectations. The atmosphere in the meeting room grew increasingly stifling as the dialogue between Director Patterson and Mrs. Lillian Davenport continued. Outside the window, the pale afternoon sunlight filtered through thin curtains, but inside, the tension mounted with each passing minute. "We have made every effort to address this situation with you respectfully," Patterson began, his voice steady but firm. "However, your actions on the flight not only impacted our staff but also caused significant discomfort to other passengers. This is something our airline cannot tolerate." Lillian leaned back in her chair, raising her chin defiantly. "I think you're exaggerating. A minor incident, and you're trying to blow it out of proportion? It seems your airline has lost its ability to handle trivial matters." Captain Harris, seated across from her, fixed her with a cold stare. "Ma'am, your actions were far from trivial. We have a responsibility to all our passengers and crew. You didn't just disrupt the flight, you threatened my staff. That is unacceptable." Suddenly, a knock at the door broke the charged silence. An employee entered, holding a tablet, his expression visibly tense. Patterson gestured for him to approach. The employee leaned in to speak softly, but his words were clear to everyone in the room. "Sir, the video of the incident on the flight has been uploaded to social media. It's spreading rapidly, with hundreds of thousands of views in just a few hours." The room fell silent. Patterson frowned as he glanced at the tablet screen, which displayed the video a few minutes long that captured Lillian throwing food, blaming Julia, and issuing sharp threats. The audio clearly recorded every insulting word she had uttered. Lillian, maintaining her arrogant demeanor, gave a dismissive laugh. "A video? Do you think something like that can affect me? I'm a successful businesswoman, not a low-level employee. I know how to handle these situations." Patterson raised his head, his gaze stern. "Ma'am, it seems you're underestimating the severity of this issue. Look at the comments." He turned the tablet toward her, revealing an outpouring of public outrage in the comments section. "Unbelievable that someone could behave like this on a flight. Absolutely disgraceful. Who is this woman? Never let her on another flight again. Feel sorry for the flight attendant. I hope the airline protects their staff." Lillian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, though she quickly regained her composure, her expression tightening as she took in the public reaction. Lillian's expression flickered. Though she tried to maintain her composure, her eyes betrayed a trace of worry. "It's just a few people online. They mean nothing to me." Harris looked directly at her, his voice steady and serious. "Ma'am, this is no longer just a personal issue between you and my staff. This has become a reputational crisis. It's not only the airline's image at stake, but also your own." Patterson added, "We've received emails from several other passengers on the flight, confirming your behavior. Some have even indicated they will reconsider flying with us if we don't handle this matter fairly." Lillian maintained her outward calm, but her hand gripped her handbag tightly, her nails pressing into the soft leather. "I have connections powerful enough to resolve this issue. You have no authority to do anything to me." Patterson raised an eyebrow, his tone unwavering. "We're not disputing your influence. But let me be clear, if this isn't addressed, it will affect not just the airline but your business as well. Several comments online have already mentioned your name and your company. This is the time for you to carefully consider your next steps." Lillian abruptly stood up, her voice sharp but tinged with unease. "You cannot threaten me. I'll handle this with my lawyers. I didn't come here to listen to baseless accusations." Patterson remained composed. "Ma'am, this isn't a threat. It's reality. If you wish to pursue legal action, we'll fully cooperate. But I suggest you carefully evaluate the potential fallout for both sides before proceeding." Lillian left the room, her confidence visibly shaken. She knew the video would cause more problems than she had initially anticipated. However, her pride would not allow her to admit it at that moment. Meanwhile, Patterson turned to Captain Harris and Caroline. "We'll hold an internal meeting to determine the formal course of action, but it's clear that the airline must stand by its employees, particularly Julia." Julia, who had been sitting quietly nearby, gave a small nod, feeling the support of her colleagues. Yet the weight of the incident lingered heavily in her heart. She knew this ordeal was pushing everyone to their limits, and she braced herself for the complex resolution that was yet to come. Following a series of internal meetings, the airline officially announced its resolution to the incident. A statement was released across major media channels the next morning, emphasizing the airline's commitment to protecting its employees and upholding service standards. During a press conference held at the airline's headquarters, CEO Patterson appeared confident as he addressed a large gathering of journalists. Our airline is steadfast in its commitment to delivering the best service while ensuring a safe and respectful working environment for our employees. After thoroughly reviewing all evidence, including video footage from passengers and feedback from the crew, we have decided to take firm action, he continued, his tone clear and resolute. Mrs. Lillian Davenport, a passenger on a recent flight, violated our code of conduct and engaged in behavior that harassed our staff. As a result, we have decided to ban her from flying on our airline for 6 months. Additionally, Mrs. Davenport will face administrative fines for disruptive behavior and violations of aviation security regulations. The announcement quickly went viral on social media and news platforms. Criticism of Lillian's actions surged, and the hashtag #JusticeForJulia began trending, garnering millions of shares and comments in support of the airline and its staff. At her home, Lillian sat frozen before her computer screen, overwhelmed by the flood of news headlines about the incident. Her phone rang incessantly, but most calls were from business partners seeking to cancel contracts or demanding explanations. Emails poured in, emphasizing that her tarnished reputation posed a significant risk to continued collaborations. During one tense phone call, her largest business partner, a senior executive, bluntly stated, "We cannot continue working with you after this incident. Your reputation has become too much of a liability. We regret this, but it's simply unacceptable." For Lillian, who had always exuded pride and confidence, it felt as though the world was turning against her. She bit her lip, but tears welled up in her eyes. The power and status she had once flaunted now seemed meaningless as she faced the devastating consequences of her own actions. A week later, Lillian arrived at the airline's office. This meeting was a condition set by the airline to help ease the media pressure and demonstrate her willingness to make amends. She entered the conference room, where the crew from the fateful flight was waiting. Julia sat quietly, maintaining her calm demeanor, though her eyes reflected the pain of what she had endured. Lillian took a deep breath, her gaze avoiding direct contact with Julia and Captain Harris. Patterson stood nearby, motioning for her to begin. "First, I want to apologize to the entire crew," she began, her voice faltering, though she forced herself to continue. "I realize my actions caused harm not just to MS, Julia, but to all of you. I was wrong to disrespect you and disrupt the experience of other passengers." Julia remained silent, offering a slight nod as she listened to the apology. In that moment, she felt neither satisfaction nor a desire for revenge, just a sense that justice had finally been served. While her apology was accepted, the consequences for Lillian did not end there. Her company faced immense pressure from the public and partners, resulting in canceled projects and severe revenue losses. Events she once attended now declined her invitations, and her name became a cautionary tale for others. As for Julia, she received widespread support from the online community and the airline itself. She was commended for her professionalism and patience in the face of adversity. Empowered by this experience, Julia decided to continue her work with renewed confidence and a firm belief that injustice, no matter how overwhelming, can be overcome with perseverance and determination. As time passed, the incident on the flight gradually faded from public attention, but its effects continued to shape the lives of those involved. It was a story not just about a single act of misconduct, but also a powerful reminder of respect, accountability, and the consequences of every decision we make. After months of turmoil, Lillian Davenport was forced to confront a harsh reality. Major business partners withdrew, her reputation was irreparably damaged in the media, and she could no longer sustain her career as she once had. Lillian came to realize that the power and status she once prided herself on could not shield her from the repercussions of arrogance and irresponsibility. In a rare interview following the incident, Lillian admitted, "I used to believe I could control everything, that my power was untouchable, but I was wrong. No one is above the respect we owe to others. I've learned that lesson in the hardest way possible." Lillian lost not only her standing in the business world, but also the trust of those around her. However, from the ruins of her reputation, she began to confront herself, accept her mistakes, and rebuild with a more humble outlook. Julia, meanwhile, continued her work as a flight attendant, but she was no longer the person who simply endured and stayed silent. Her story became a source of inspiration, demonstrating professionalism and perseverance in the face of injustice. Julia received recognition from the airline and widespread support from the public. But for her, the most important outcome was preserving her self-worth no matter the circumstances. One evening, during a long-haul flight, Julia received a letter from a passenger who had followed the incident. The message was brief but meaningful. Thank you for maintaining your dignity. Your actions showed me that, even in small ways, we can confront and overcome injustice. Julia read the letter, a gentle smile spreading across her face. Deep down, she understood that every small battle, every effort made, carried immense significance not only for herself but also for others. The airline not only handled the incident fairly but also implemented improved policies to better protect its employees. Conflict resolution and customer communication training sessions became more widespread, and the airline publicly reaffirmed that harassment of staff by anyone would not be tolerated. CEO Patterson, in an interview following the incident, stated this was not just a lesson for our airline but a reminder for everyone. Power or status can never excuse trampling on someone else's dignity. We must strive to create an environment founded on mutual respect, regardless of rank or circumstances. The story closed with a clear message: every action carries consequences, not only for ourselves but also for those around us. Power or status can never stand above respect and responsibility. Passengers, employees, business leaders, everyone plays a role in building a fair and harmonious society. Mistakes are inevitable, but what matters most is how we face them, learn from them, and make amends. The story of Julia and Lillian spread widely, not just as a tale of criticism or judgment, but as a reminder that dignity and self-respect are protected not only by laws but also by the solidarity and responsibility we owe each other. On another flight, Julia was helping passengers settle into their seats. An elderly woman smiled at her and said quietly, "Thank you not just for the excellent service but for showing us a true example." Julia nodded, her eyes shining with conviction. She knew that no matter how challenging the trials, maintaining dignity and patience would always be the strongest way to overcome them. Thank you for joining us on this emotional and meaningful journey. Your support is a tremendous motivation for our channel to continue delivering quality, inspiring, and valuable content. If you enjoyed this story and the messages we share, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss new content. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts, as every piece of feedback helps our channel grow. Together, we can create a community where values like respect, fairness, and dignity are celebrated. Thank you for your companionship and invaluable support.